The Ironhold Depot was not a pretty place. It hung in orbit above a massive gas giant like a rusted nail caught in the wind. Pipes ran everywhere. Oil stains covered the floors. The smell of burning fuel and hot metal was always in the air. It was loud, it was dirty, and most of the alien species who came through hated every minute they spent there. Cal Dunning loved it. He was 34 years old, with short brown hair and hands that were always cut or bruised from working. He did not talk much. He did not smile much either, not because he was unhappy, but because he was always thinking about the next broken thing that needed fixing. He had been a mechanic his whole life. His father had been one too, and the old analog wrench Cal carried in his back pocket had belonged to him. It was heavy and scratched and worth nothing to anyone else. To Cal, it was the most important thing he owned. He worked the Ironhold Depot alone, mostly. The other humans on the station knew him well enough. Nadia Cole, who ran the logistics desk, sometimes brought him food when she thought he had forgotten to eat, which was often. Pete Armas, a dock worker with a loud laugh, liked to stop by Cal's bay and talk about nothing for 10 minutes at a time. Cal would nod and keep working, and Pete never seemed to mind. The aliens who came through Ironhold were a different story. They tolerated Cal the way most of them tolerated the whole station, as a necessary stop, nothing more. Some of them barely looked at him. That was fine. Cal was not there to be looked at. He was there to fix things. On the morning everything changed. A Vortak transport vessel came in hot. The Vortak were large. That was the first thing anyone noticed about them. They stood twice the height of a human, with thick-scaled bodies, long necks, and eyes the color of deep amber. Their ships looked like them, too, heavy and armored, built more like fortresses than vessels. This one had taken damage somewhere in the outer belt. One of its rear engines was still burning when it landed in Bay 7, throwing sparks across the hangar floor. The Vortak crew came out fast, all 6 of them, moving with the kind of controlled anger that said they were embarrassed about the condition of their ship. They refused help from the station crew. They spoke to station management in short, sharp sentences. The Vortak did not like asking for things. They did not like needing things. They were proud in a way that went all the way down to the bone, and they made sure everyone around them knew it. Cal watched them from a distance and went back to his work. He was halfway through pulling a fuel injector from a broken cargo runner when he heard it. It was small, thin, high-pitched and frightened in a way that cut right through the noise of the hangar. It did not sound like machinery. It did not sound like any alarm he knew. It sounded like something small and scared and alone. Cal set down his tools and walked toward the sound. The engine discharge pit for Bay 7 was a wide metal trench that ran along the far wall of the hangar, used to vent heat and exhaust from ships during landing. It was still glowing. The air above it shimmered and waved. And down inside it, sitting on the hot metal floor of the pit with its small legs tucked under it and its tiny wings pressed flat against its sides, was a Vortak hatchling. It was no bigger than a large dog. Its scales were pale, not yet darkened to the deep color of an adult. Its amber eyes were wide and wet. It opened its small mouth and made that sound again, that horrible, frightened cry, and Cal felt something pull tight in his chest. He looked around. The Vortak crew were at the other end of the hangar, still arguing with the station manager. They had not noticed. Or if they had, they were not moving. The Vortak did not show distress in public. It was not something they did, not in front of outsiders. The hatchling could cry all it wanted, and not one of them would run to it where others could see. The pit was still hot. Cal could feel the heat from where he stood. He did not think about it. He thought about it later, when people asked him. He tried to explain that there was nothing to think about, that it was simply something that had to be done, the way you had to fix a broken pipe or replace a damaged seal. The hatchling was small and scared and in danger. That was enough. He jumped in. The heat hit him hard. His boots were thick and took most of it on the ground, but the metal edges of the pit burned through his gloves when he grabbed them for balance. He crossed the trench in 4 long steps, bent down, and picked up the hatchling. It was heavier than he expected. It twisted in his arms for a moment, making small alarmed sounds, its claws catching on his jacket. Then it went still. He held it against his chest and climbed back out of the pit, his left arm scraping the hot edge as he pulled himself up. He sat down on the hangar floor. His hands were burned. His left arm hurt badly. He did not put the hatchling down. He pulled off his jacket one-handed and wrapped it loosely around the small creature, keeping it warm in the way you would keep anything small and cold and frightened warm. The hangar had gone quiet. He looked up. Every alien in the bay was staring at him. The station crew was staring. And at the far end of the hangar, all 6 members of the Vortak crew had turned to face him. They stood very still. The station manager had stopped talking mid-sentence. At the front of the Vortak crew stood a large female. She was older than the others. Her scales were darker, her eyes steadier. She wore no armor, just a long coat of dark material that reached the hangar floor. She was looking at Cal with an expression he could not read at all. Cal looked back at her. Then he looked down at the hatchling in his arms, who had stopped crying. Its small amber eyes were looking up at him with something that might have been curiosity. He stayed on the floor. His arm was burning. He did not move. Nobody moved for a long time. The medbay at Ironhold Depot was a small room near the east corridor, clean but basic. It smelled like antiseptic and had 2 beds that were never both empty at the same time. Cal sat on the edge of one of them while the station medic, a quiet alien with 4 thin arms, wrapped his left arm in cooling gauze. Nadia Cole stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. She had a look on her face that she got whenever she was trying to decide whether to be angry or worried, and had not yet picked one. Cal looked at his hands. The burns were not deep, but they covered most of both palms and the inside of his left forearm. They ached in that dull, heavy way that told him they would ache for days. Nadia said his name the way she did when she had been waiting to say it. He looked up. She came over, pulled up the chair next to the bed, sat down, and looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Did you even stop to think?" Cal said, "Not really." She pressed her lips together. Then she reached over and checked the edge of the gauze on his arm, even though the medic had already done it. Pete Armos came in an hour later with 2 cups of the station coffee, which was terrible and too thin and tasted faintly of metal. He handed one to Cal. Cal drank it without saying anything. Pete sat in the corner and talked about the time one of the cargo lifts had broken and dropped a crate of alien food paste all over the lower deck, and how nobody had been able to get the smell out for 2 weeks. Cal nodded in the right places. It helped, actually. It made the room feel like a normal room again. The Vortak ship did not leave. Cal heard about it the next morning. Their engines had been fixed by evening, which meant they could have been gone by nightfall. They were not. The ship sat in Bay 7 with its landing clamps still down and no departure request filed. Nobody knew why. On the second day, Nadia told him that the large female Vortak had been seen walking the outer corridor of the station twice. Alone. No guards. That was not normal. Vortak did not walk the corridors of other species stations alone. They did not go anywhere without rank and reason. On the third day, Cal was in the repair yard near the back of the station, replacing the exhaust coupling on a small courier drone, when he heard footsteps behind him. He knew before he turned around that they were too heavy and too even to belong to anyone human. The female Vortak stood at the entrance to the repair yard. She was still wearing the long dark coat. Up close she was even larger than he remembered, her head nearly brushing the top of the doorframe. She looked at him with those steady amber eyes and did not speak right away. Cal set down his wrench. He waited. She came forward slowly and stopped a few feet away. When she spoke, it was in Galactic common, low and careful, like someone choosing each word. She said her name was Karathvel. She said she was the elder of this crew. She asked if she could speak to him. Cal said yes. Karathvel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We do not have a word in our language for what you did." Cal looked at her. She continued. She said that the Vortak had words for courage in battle. They had words for sacrifice among kin. They had words for the kind of bravery that came from training and duty and loyalty. But they did not have a word for a creature with no connection to the hatchling, no obligation, no reason, who simply jumped into fire because the hatchling was crying. She said, "We have never needed that word. It has never happened before. Not with an outsider." Cal was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what the hatchling's name was. Karathvel paused. She said her name was Arev. Cal nodded. He asked if Arev was okay. Karathvel said she was unharmed. Then she asked him the question directly, without softening it. Why did you do it? Cal thought about it for a second. Then he said, she was scared and small. That's enough. Carothvel looked at him for a long time. The repair yard was quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, a pipe was rattling the way it always did in the afternoon cycle. Cal met her eyes and waited. Then Carothvel reached out one large hand and pressed a single claw to the back of Cal's right hand. It did not hurt. That was the first thing he noticed. It felt warm, like holding your hand near something that was cooling down after a long burn. The warmth spread across the back of his hand slowly, and then the skin there shifted, not tearing, not breaking, but changing, the way metal changes color when it moves through heat. The pattern that settled into his skin was dark and fine, like the edge of a scale pressed into clay. It covered the back of his hand from the knuckles to the wrist. It glowed once, briefly, the color of cooling iron. Then it went still. Carothvel pulled her claw back. She looked at the mark on his hand. Then she looked at him. She said, "This is the Drathkale. The flame bonded. It is given only within our bloodlines, only to those who have walked into fire for one of our own. In the whole of our recorded history, it has never been placed on an outsider." She said, "It means that every Vorthak, anywhere, will know what you are. And every Vorthak, anywhere, will answer for you." Then she turned and walked back out of the repair yard without another word. Cal stood there for a while. He looked at his hand. The mark was dark and quiet against his skin, sitting there like it had always been there, like it was simply part of him. Nadia found him 20 minutes later, still standing in the same spot. She saw the mark immediately and asked what it was. He told her what Carothvel had explained, as best he could. Nadia stared at his hand for a long moment. The Vorthak transport left the following morning. Cal was in the yard when it lifted off. As the heavy ship turned and began its slow climb out of the bay, he caught a small movement in one of the lower portholes. A tiny pale claw pressed flat against the glass. He raised his marked hand. The ship kept climbing. Cal watched it until it was gone. 8 months after the Vorthak ship left Ironhold Depot, Cal Dunning was lying on his back under the secondary engine housing of a salvage vessel called the Sable June, trying to convince a stuck compression valve to come loose without breaking it. The valve was not cooperating. He had been hired on 3 months earlier by Lou Hargrove, the captain of the Sable June. Lou was in her 50s, short and broad, with gray hair she kept pulled back and a way of talking that was direct without being rude. She had seen the mark on his hand when he first came aboard. She had not asked about it. He had liked her immediately. The crew was small. Devtran was the ship's engineer, young and fast and a little too confident in a way that usually worked out fine. There were 2 alien crew members as well, a navigator and a cargo handler, both experienced and quiet. The Sable June ran salvage and repair contracts wherever it could find them, which meant spending a lot of time in places that were not particularly safe. The Ashfin Belt was not particularly safe. It was a long corridor of space between 2 occupied systems, packed with asteroids that were rich in minerals and therefore full of people fighting over them. Corporate extraction fleets ran heavy equipment through the belt constantly. Independent miners worked the edges. And cutting through all of it, taking what they wanted, was the Iron Tooth Collective, a pirate operation that had been running the Ashfin for years and had no intention of stopping. The Sable June had a repair contract at a small mining outpost near the middle of the belt. It was supposed to be straightforward. It was not. They were 2 hours out from the outpost when the Iron Tooth ships appeared on the scanner. 3 of them, heavy and fast, moving to block the Sable June's path. Lou put the ship into a slow hold and said a single word very quietly under her breath. Then she opened the ship channel and told the crew to stay calm. They were boarded within the hour. The Iron Tooth Collective was multi-species, which was the first thing Cal noticed when they came through the airlock. The boarding party was 6 beings, armed and efficient, moving with the ease of people who had done this many times. But the largest 3, the ones who came in first and stayed in front, were Herek. Cal had read about the Herek but never seen them in person. They were dragonkin, like the Vorthak, but where the Vorthak were controlled and ancient in their manner, the Herek were blunt and loud. Their scales were darker, their builds heavier, and they wore their aggression openly. They worked as enforcers for the Iron Tooth because they were very good at it. The commander of the boarding party was a Herek male. He was scarred along the left side of his jaw and neck, old marks that had healed rough. He came aboard and immediately began taking stock of the ship and its crew with the calm efficiency of someone doing an inventory. Lou stepped forward and started talking, which was the right move. Lou could talk to anyone. Cal stood with the rest of the crew near the far wall of the cargo bay. He kept his hands visible and his face neutral. The Herrick commander moved down the line of crew members, looking at each of them. He stopped when he reached Cal. He looked at Cal's face. Then he looked down at Cal's right hand. The scar-faced Herrick went very still. His eyes stayed on the mark on the back of Cal's hand. The dark scale-patterned mark that Corothvel had placed there 8 months ago. The Drathcale. The flame bonded. The commander said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned and said something in a language Cal did not know to one of the other Herrick. The second Herrick looked at Cal's hand, then looked at the commander. Something passed between them that Cal could not read. The commander raised one hand slowly and the rest of his boarding party stopped moving. He pulled out a communication device and walked to the far corner of the cargo bay. He spoke into it in a low voice for about 2 minutes. Cal could not hear what was said. Lou had stopped talking. The whole crew was very still. Nobody seemed to know what was happening, which was worse, in some ways, than knowing. The commander came back. He looked at Cal again. Then he looked at Lou and said that the Sable June was free to continue on its route. That was all. Nobody moved for a second. Then Lou said, "Understood. Thank you." The boarding party left. The airlock sealed. The 3 iron tooth ships pulled back and held their position as the Sable June moved slowly forward through the belt. Nobody spoke on the bridge for a full 2 minutes. Then Devtran said, "What just happened?" Lou turned to look at Cal. He could feel everyone looking at him. He thought about trying to explain it, about Corothvel and the pit and the hatchling and the mark, and how he had started to read about the Drathcale in the months since it had been placed on him, and what the old record said about it. Lou said, "Cal, what was that?" Cal looked at his hand. The mark sat there the same way it always did, quiet and dark and a little cooler looking than the rest of his skin. He said, "I think I'm starting to understand." Lou waited. The rest of the crew waited. He said, "The mark is very old. It goes back further than most treaties. The Herrick and the Vortak are not allies. They are not even friendly. But there are things that are older than alliances, and one of them is that mark." He paused. He said, "I don't think they knew what to do with it on someone like me." Lou stared at him for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the controls and said, "All right. Someone make coffee. We have a contract to finish." Cal looked out the forward window at the dark belt of rock and shadow ahead of them. Somewhere in the distance, the iron tooth ships were still holding position, watching the Sable June move away. He wondered what the Herrick commander had said when he called in. He wondered who had answered. The signal came in the middle of the night cycle. It was not a distress call and it was not a standard communication. It came in on a frequency that Cal had not known about until the day it arrived, a deep channel signal tied to the mark on his hand the way a lock is tied to a key. The mark had been there for 10 months now, and this was the first time it had done anything at all, besides sit on his skin and occasionally catch the light. He was asleep when it started. What woke him was a low hum, felt more than heard, coming from his right hand. He sat up in his bunk, looked at the mark in the dark, and watched it glow very faintly, the same color as cooling iron, pulsing once every few seconds like a slow heartbeat. He put on his headset and found the signal. It was not distress. It was an invitation. Lou Hargrove did not argue when he brought it to her in the morning, which told him she trusted him more than she let on. She looked at the coordinates on the display for a long moment. They were deep inside Vortak territory, a part of space that no non-Vortak vessel had entered voluntarily and been allowed to remain in living memory. She looked at her crew. She looked at Cal. She said, "All right. We go." They were met at the border of Vortak space by an escort fleet. Dev Tran, who was sitting at the scanner station when the ships appeared, made a sound that was not quite a word. There were 9 of them, warships, each one larger than anything the Sable June had any business being near. They arranged themselves on either side of the Sable June like walls and guided the small salvage vessel forward without a word of communication beyond a single short message that said, "You are expected. Follow." The crew of the Sable June did not talk much for the next few hours. Cal stood at the forward window and watched the Vortex ships around them. They were beautiful, in the way that old, serious things could be beautiful. Deep-hulled and dark, with lines that spoke of age and weight and long history. The station they arrived at was unlike anything Cal had seen in 10 years of working deep space. It was called the Charveth. The name meant the House of Embers in Vortak. It had been built around the remains of a star that had died a very long time ago, the structure wrapped around and through the old stellar core like a shell that had grown over centuries. It was enormous and dark, and it glowed from the inside with deep orange light, like something that had been burning for a very long time and intended to keep burning. They docked without incident. Cal went aboard alone, which was his choice and also the Vortak's expectation. The docking bay was attended by 6 Vortak in formal dress, which was a kind of layered armor that was worn for ceremony rather than battle. They walked him through the interior of the Charveth without speaking. The main chamber was large enough to make him feel very small. Korothvel was there. She looked the same as he remembered, steady and dark-eyed, wearing the long coat she had worn at Ironhold Depot. She inclined her head when she saw him, which he had since learned was the Vortak equivalent of a significant greeting. And beside her, sitting on the floor with its legs folded neatly under it and its head tilted at an angle that was unmistakably curious, was a Rev. She was bigger than he remembered. She came up to his waist now, her scales settling into the deeper color they would hold as she grew, pale amber shading to a warm brown at the edges. Her eyes were the same, though, wide and bright and direct. She looked at him the way she had looked at him from inside his jacket on the hangar floor of Ironhold Depot, like she was still trying to figure out what kind of creature he was. She stood up and walked directly to him. She was close enough that he could feel the warmth that all Vortax seemed to carry in their skin. Then she pressed the top of her head against his chest. It was not quite gentle, the way a hatchling's version of gentle was not quite gentle, but it was deliberate. The Vortak around them made no sound, but Cal felt the shift in the room the way you felt a change in pressure. Korothvel said, "She has been asking about you since she learned to speak." Cal looked down at a Rev, who had stepped back and was now looking up at him with an expression he could only read as patient waiting. A Rev said, in careful Galactic common, each word placed like a stone being set into a wall, "Why did you do it?" Cal crouched down so he was at her eye level. He looked at her for a second. Then he said the same thing he had said to Korothvel on the day it happened. "You were scared and small. That's enough." A Rev was quiet for a moment. Her amber eyes moved over his face. Then she said, "Then I will be large one day, and not scared. And I will remember." The council meeting was long and difficult. The Vortak High Council was made up of 7 ancient beings who had been leading their people for longer than most species had been in space. They sat in a raised circle in the council chamber of the Charveth and debated in the old Vortak language for nearly 2 hours while Cal stood below them and waited. Korothvel stood nearby. She translated nothing. Cal gathered that this was intentional, that the debate was for the council and not for him. At the end of it, the eldest of the council, a female whose scales had gone nearly white with age, leaned forward and spoke in Galactic common. She said, "The mark was given. The mark is real. The act was witnessed. Whether we are comfortable with what the mark is wearing is a question of feeling, not of fact. Fact does not ask how we feel about it." The council recognized Cal Dunning as Drathkale. On the walk back to the docking bay, Cal passed the rest of the Sable June crew waiting in an antechamber. They had been given food and water and a room to sit in and nothing else. Dev Tran stood up when Cal came in. He looked at Cal's expression and said, "Are we going to be vaporized?" Cal said, "No." Lou said, "What happened in there?" Cal thought about the council chamber, about the ancient female who had spoken, about a Rev pressing her head against his chest, about Korothvel's face when a Rev asked her question. He said, "I think we just made some very complicated friends." Nadia, who had made the trip from Ironhold and was sitting in the corner looking like she had been holding her breath for 3 hours, said, "How are you this calm about all of this?" Cal looked at the mark on his hand. He turned it over once. Then he said, "I just fixed something that was broken. That's all I ever do." Nadia stared at him. Somewhere behind him, through the thick walls of the Charveth, something moved. Slow and warm and alive. A Rev was watching him go. 2 years after the burning yard at Ironhold Depot, the Ashfin Belt was in the middle of a slow war that nobody had officially named yet. The Velsar had been moving through the corridor for 6 months, a mercenary species hired by a coalition of corporate extraction fleets to clear out anyone who got in the way of their operations. The Velsar were good at it. They were methodical and patient, and they did not stop until the job was done. They had pushed 3 independent clans out of the inner belt already. They had destroyed 2 outposts. And now they had found a group of displaced Vortak near the far edge of the belt, a colony of young adults, hatchlings, and elders who had fled a destroyed settlement 3 systems over and were trying to find stable ground. The Velsar fleet had them cornered against a dense asteroid field with no clear exit. The Vortak ships were old. There were not enough of them. They were running low on fuel and they knew it. They sent a broadcast on all frequencies. It was not a distress call, not the way most species would write one. It did not say, "Please help," or "We are under attack," or "Send assistance." The Vortak did not phrase things that way. It was a position report, calm and precise, stating their location and their situation in the flat tone of people who were recording facts rather than asking for anything. But the facts were clear. And the facts said that they were going to lose. The Sable June picked up the signal in the outer belt, 2 hours away. Lou Hargrove read it twice. She pulled up the tactical display and looked at the numbers. Then she looked at her crew. Dev Tran was at his station. The alien navigator was at hers. Nadia Cole, who had been riding with the Sable June for 2 months on a logistics contract and therefore had no business being anywhere near this, was standing by the door to the bridge with her arms crossed. Lou said, "Cal?" Cal was already on his feet. He did not have a warship. He had a salvage vessel with a good engine and a reliable hull and a crew who trusted him. He had a long-range communicator, and he had the mark on his hand, and he had been reading about the Drathkale for 2 years now, enough to know what the old records said about what it meant and who it reached. He sat down at the communications console. He found the Dragonkin deep-frequency channel, the one that ran underneath the standard galactic bands, the one tied to a history that was older than most current borders. He opened a signal. He gave coordinates. He gave the situation in simple terms. Then he said, "I'm going in. If the mark means anything, I would appreciate company." He cut the signal. He told Lou to take the Sable June in toward the asteroid field at maintenance speed, broadcasting a salvage claim on the belt's commercial frequency. It was legal cover, barely, the kind of thing that would hold up just long enough to make the Velsar pause and verify before acting. Lou looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "All right. Everyone hold on." The Velsar fleet moved to intercept them 12 minutes out from the asteroid field. There were 7 ships, well-armed and in a clean formation. Their lead vessel hailed the Sable June and asked its business in a tone that was not really asking. Lou answered. She talked about the salvage claim. She was very good at talking. Cal stood at the forward window and watched the asteroid field. Something moved in the shadow between 2 large rocks. Then something else moved. The first ship that came out was Herek. It was a warship, dark and heavy, bearing the marks of Dugratha's fleet, the same fleet that had boarded the Sable June in this very belt 2 years earlier. It moved out from the asteroid field slowly, like something that was in no hurry because it did not need to be. Then a second ship came out. Vortak. Then 2 more Herek ships. Then a vessel Cal did not recognize at all, long and low, with markings he had never seen, belonging to a dragonkin species he had never encountered. Then more. They came out of the asteroid field in 1s and 2s and small groups, spreading into a line that stretched across the belt in both directions until it was the longest line of ships Cal had ever seen in one place. They were not in formation. They had not coordinated their approach. They had simply come when the signal reached them and found each other at the same place, and now they were here. The Velsar fleet went silent. The Velsar commander hailed the assembled ships after a very long pause. His voice was controlled, but Cal knew shock when he heard it. The commander asked who was in command of this force. The channel stayed quiet for a moment. Then Karathvel's voice came through, clear and steady, from somewhere in the line of ships. She spoke 3 words in the old Dragonkin tongue. They were not galactic common, and they were not meant for the Velsar. The translation came through half a second later for anyone listening who needed it, including the Velsar commander. She said, "The flame-bonded called. We came." There is no commander here. There is only fire. The Velsar fleet withdrew. It took about 20 minutes, which was how long it took a fleet of 7 ships to decide that the answer to the question they were looking at was no, and to begin moving in the opposite direction. They did it in silence. They did not respond to any further hailing. They simply turned and went. The displaced Vortak were escorted safely out of the belt by the end of that cycle. Cal watched them from the bridge of the Sable June, these pale-scaled young ones and their elders moving slowly in their old ships toward open space, protected on all sides by the fleet that had answered a short signal from a salvage mechanic with a mark on his hand. Later, when the line of Dragonkin ships had spread back to wherever they had come from, Arev found Cal on the lower deck of the Sable June. She had come aboard during the operation without asking, which was simply her way, and was too large now to stand fully upright in the lower corridor. She had to duck her head, which she seemed to find mildly annoying. She sat beside him on the deck. For a while neither of them said anything. Then Arev said, "You were not scared." Cal looked at his hand. The mark. The burned skin. The old wrench calluses his father had had in the same places. He said, "I was a little scared." Arev made a sound in her chest. It was low and rhythmic, rolling out slowly like the sound of something large settling after a long effort. It took him a second to understand what it was. She was laughing. He smiled at that. He could not help it. Out in the galaxy, in records that would be updated and discussed and argued over for years, a new entry was being written. It would be translated into Galactic Common eventually, for those who needed it, and it would read, "The first Drathkale of outside blood. A human. A mechanic." He ran into fire because something small was crying. This is apparently what humans do. In the lower deck of the Sable June, Cal Dunning sat on the floor next to a laughing dragon and thought about the next thing that needed fixing. There was always something. Somewhere above him, in the engine bay, a pipe fitting was working itself loose. He could hear it. He would take care of it in the morning. Arev stretched out her long neck and rested her chin on the floor beside him, her amber eyes half closed, warm and easy. She was taking notes.